Okay, so Cassidy, when you're in here with us, you want to probably turn off your sound totally.
Yeah.
Um, and then I'm gonna. Does it sound like the TV's muted?
It's on.
Because I hear myself still somehow. It's not just in my head, right?
I think it must go into
Okay, good.
dimension level.
I need Firefox.
Got it.
Alright, see if I can make these big enough for everybody to see. I haven't had two sections like this before. It's interesting. So you notice that they're just kind of overall ones. If you have a question about your grade, you don't want to talk to me publicly here. What you want to do is, catch me after class. Say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about my grade. And then when we're not recording things, and all that stuff, we can talk about your grade because you don't want that stuff public. Is that big enough for everybody to see? Hold on here, let me zoom in a bit. I can zoom in on this one a lot. There we go. Okay, so everybody who's logged in at home, let me know if you can hear me. Type in a Y into the chat box or a yes or something so that I can tell you can hear me.
Okay. Just hit volume down.
Echo myself. Ashley Unique, all right, good. Cassie, is that seeable?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, guys, I have 11 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. First of all, welcome to week number 3 of psychology. Today we're going to get into a bunch of really cool things. So remember, I'm posting this here and recording this for the people at home. So if you're watching this on recording, what you want to do if you want to talk to me about your grade is, after this you want to email me or call me or see me in class or something and say, hey, why is my grade this? Let me see what my assignments have been and that sort of thing. But this is current intent up to date. The only thing that's not in there is the research. I haven't quite gotten to all the research yet. Some people have posted some very nice research though, some of which I will show today at the end of class. Let me get rid of this and bring us back to where we can see what we need to see. Today we're going to talk about psychological theories. If you've seen the work for the week video that I made, it's basically just talking about how to take notes on the psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic theories that we'll talk about today, because you're going to need those for the test that we're going to have on all the theories once we get done with all the theories. So it's going to take us about 3 weeks to get through all the theories, right? We're going to start with the first one. We're going to go in chronological order. So we're going to start from the first one, and then we're going to go on. So get your notes ready. If you want to, now I put it in the bottom, if you notice the bottom left-hand part of the screen, down here where it says School of Thought Summary, you might want to open that up if you have Word on your computer and you're typing, because you can just type your notes into that, and it's going to kind of organize them for you too. So that might be something you might want to do. But basically what you're going to do after we're done talking about all the theories is you'll have these school of thought papers, and each school of thought paper is going to encapsulate one major philosophy, right? So we're going to do psychoanalysis today, and then next week we're going to do the humanists and the behaviorists, and then the next week after that we're going to do the cognitive theory. So um, by the end of it, you're going to have 5 school of thought papers, and on the papers will be the answering the kinds of questions you see in the notes section, right? Each theory has an idea of what defines healthy and what makes people healthy or not healthy. Each theory talks about where problems come from, and each theory talks about what treatment should look like for those problems, right? So, okay, Unique, no problem. And Christina and uh, Sam, can you hear me? I didn't get a confirmation of whether you could or not. Yeah? Okay, good. All right, guys, we ready to continue? We are going to be taking notes, Ashley. Yes, we are. All right, and this is going to be on the first theory ever developed in psychology called psychoanalysis. So we're going to go in chronological order, like I said, right? We'll start with the psychoanalysts, and we'll progress all the way through up into the more modern theories that developed in the 80s and the 90s. Okay? All right, so here we go. First, I want to talk a little bit about where they come from. Okay? So if you're following along in the school of thought summary, what you're going to see is, hold on, let me mute myself. What you're going to see in the school of thought thing is the first part of it is about the sort of the theorists and the history. So here we're going to start. All right. So psychoanalysis and it's the psychodynamic part of it is kind of like a brother. We'll talk about in a bit. But that was the first theory ever developed, and it was developed in Victorian era Vienna. So we're talking Vienna, Austria, and we're talking the 1890s through the 1950s or so. And it was the Victorian era in Europe at the time, right? So that really colors how the theorists view problems. It colors how the theorists view what defines healthy. It colors how they do their treatment too. It was based off of interactions with very wealthy women. So the theory that Freud developed was all based around his interactions with these wealthy women, right? And these wealthy women had a whole bunch of time on their hands because they were rich, and they were born into money, or they married rich husbands, or both, right? And so they had a lot of free time on their hands, and so they would come and meet with Freud at least once a week, every week for years. I mean, we're talking decades sometimes. And throughout those interactions that he had with those clients, he developed this theory. And I'm interested at the end of this, we're going to have a little discussion about what you think of it. And I'm interested to see what you guys think of this theory. Okay, so it's based off interactions with affluent women clients. It was considered the first theory ever devised, right? And Freud was a real pioneer in terms of psychology, in terms of organizing a bunch of different kind of disciplines together. Remember last week we talked about how psychology is part sociology and part neuroscience and part anthropology and cultural things. We talked about how psychology has a bunch of these influences in it, right? And Freud was the first person to bring them all together. Okay, so since this was considered the first theoretical basis of anything in psychology, everything else is going to spring from this too. So this is why we're going to take our time and do this today, and then the next couple times we meet, we might do a couple at a time. But this is the foundation for everything else. And one thing you should know is that all the early psychologists that we'll talk about today all got together in the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. So they would meet all the time because they were all colleagues and they were all in Vienna. And they would meet and they would have coffee and cigars and talk about their clients, talk about psychology, talk about their theories that they were creating so that they had ideas to bounce off one another, And And so Freud used the Psychoanalytic Society to kind of hone his theory over 5 or 6 years, and then he used the rest of the time that he was practicing to kind of, um, practice that theory. And so Freud, Jung, and Adler are the three psychologists that we're going to talk about this week. They're the major theorists. And I know it says Jung, but it's pronounced Jung. And Alfred Adler is the other one. And they were all meeting together in the Psychoanalytic Society at one point. And so they were all friends. They all knew each other. They all practiced kind of together. Um, they would talk about clients and psychoanalysis together. Eventually, though, Freud and Adler broke away from Freud and they created their own theories. And that's where we get into the psychodynamic school of thought. The psychoanalysis one is Freud, and then psychodynamics are some of the later ones. And we'll talk a little bit about why Jung and Adler broke away here in a little bit once we get to them. But let's talk a little bit about what psychoanalysis is. So this is Freud we're talking about first, and his theories. And he believed that a person's current state of being, is what he would call it, is really a product of everything that's happened to them in their early childhood. And all these things that happen to you in your early childhood, they kind of build up inside you in this place he called the unconscious. Hi, Carrie, how are you? We're just getting started on some note-taking today about the psychoanalysts. So you might want to grab your notes here and start from where we are. Cool. Okay, so he said that a person's mental state, even if they're 40, 50, 60 years old, stems from their early childhood experiences, right? What happened to them when they were small. And so he was talking early childhood experiences. He was talking from the time you were born through the years that you were a baby and a toddler, and up until 8 or 10. That's the kind of the time span we're talking. And then everything else comes from that time period in your life. And he believed another thing about human nature, in that people have these internal drives and impulses, instincts, which affect their current behavior. So we'll talk about the different kinds of instincts that people have here in a little bit. But that's kind of the foundation. That's what he believed about people, And remember that this stuff comes from his work with the affluent upper class of Vienna at the time, right? So these women he would talk to had problems that stemmed from these areas, and so this is where he develops his theory. Okay, so now we need to talk about what defines healthy, right? So you see our notes down at the bottom there. I want you to be thinking about that, because that's going to be important, because we're going to see in psychoanalysis that that's different from the humanists and behaviorists and all the other theories that are coming later. Bless you, hold on. So what makes people healthy? Well, to a psychoanalyst, health is a successful negotiation of psychosexual stages. I don't know if that means anything to you yet, but because we haven't talked about the stages. But he believed that if people made it through the stages of development when they were small, then they were healthy as adults, right? So we're talking, if you had this a problem as a child, between the ages of 0 and 8, then that would affect you for the rest of your life. So he said if you can get through those and adjust well to those, because everybody's going to have problems, but if you can get through those and do well by the time you're 8 or 9, then you're going to be a relatively well-adjusted person when you're older. And another thing that he would say that is healthy is having no unresolved childhood conflicts. So if you experienced trauma as a child, of course I would bet we would all agree that that affects you later on in your life. And he would say that if it doesn't get resolved, then that is really harmful to your future. And the third thing is that as long as you are conscious of some of the things that have been buried in your unconscious, that will help you understand why you behave the way you do. So he would say that, being knowledgeable about the things that are in your unconscious makes you healthy. But that if you don't know the things that are in your unconscious, he says that is when problems will happen. Okay, I want to pause for a second and answer questions. Anybody have any questions so far? Well, I know you have questions. What questions do you have? I should ask it that way because you may not want to ask them in front of everybody, but I hope you do. Because I'm sure if you're having a question, someone else has a question. That's how it always works. Okay, well, if you don't have a question, or you don't want to share your question right now, maybe during the discussion we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, so I talked about the stages, right? I wouldn't write this all down right now because there's no way for you to do it. Christina's question is, so they're saying that the stage we're at now is because of our childhood. Yes, that is exactly what they would say. They would say that your current state of being and how you see the world and how happy you are, how unhappy you are, that all stems from your early childhood. Okay, now these are the psychosexual state, Freud's psychosexual stages. Okay, and you can see that there's once you get toward the end, toward the latency and the genital stages, that you know they're kind of like huge gaps in time, where it starts off like birth to 1 year is the oral stage, the anal stage is 1 to 3 years where you're learning potty training, the phallic stage is 3 to 6 years, right? You can see how once he gets to that he's not so interested in what happens to you after 7 years old, right? Because that stuff isn't as effective. No problem, Unique. We're here for you. So what I'm saying to you right now is don't necessarily write this down because you don't need all the stages at this point of the discussion, okay? But I want to talk a little bit about them, right? So the first stage when you're little, from birth to 1 year old, is, he says, it's the oral stage, right? And you can see that in babies, right? Because Samantha's already saying weird. Um, the when you're young, right, you're worried about nursing first, right, and then you're worried about eating and feeding yourself, right, and you're worried about going from solid food or going from liquid foods to solid foods, right, and there's a lot of stuff that has to do with oral in terms of even with speaking. You start first making sounds too, um, and so birth to 1 year he would say is the oral stage, and you're focused on oral nourishment, he would say, and your id dominates because of the pleasure principle. And we'll talk about the id here in a little bit when we talk about personality. But basically, what I want to say about the id now is that think of the id as the thing that is like your base instinct, and you have a couple of them, right? You have the instinct to survive, you have the instinct to reproduce, you have an instinct to find pleasurable things to occupy your time, right? That's why it's called the pleasure principle. Okay, so on the right-hand side, right, the adult fixation side, he would say that these problems, the ones that are listed there, come from not doing so well in this birth the first year time of your life, right? So if you're orally aggressive, if you are really sarcastic, if you love chewing gum or smoking or eating or kissing, or if you're gullible or immature, all those things come from this birth to first year time in your life. And if you don't negotiate it very well, then you might have those problems. Okay. Then after the first year, right, when you're a little kid, after the first year, then you start, then you go to the anal stage, which is called the anal stage because you're focused on potty training, right? And there's this, he would say there's a conflict between the id, the pleasurable things that you do in your life, and the ego. The ego is like your regulator. We'll get into that in a sec. So you don't have to know the id and the ego yet. But he said in this stage we have a conflict between the id and the ego. And so if you are obsessively organized, if you're really neat or like perfectionistic, or if you are, or if you're the opposite, right? If you're reckless and careless and defiant and disorganized. So if you're either end of the spectrum, of like being totally neat or being, wildly disorganized, then you didn't do this stage very well. So you must have had problems potty training. And then the phallic stage is from 3 to 6 years, right? That's the beginning of your bodily awareness, right? And he views it in kind of a sexual way. And some of the later, like we talked about Jung and Adler, some of the later psychoanalysts, psychodynamic sorts of thought, departed here. But so I'm sure you've heard of Oedipus, but if you haven't, you should Google that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the Electra complexes, right? So if you're a girl, you have uh, the Electra complex, and if you're a boy, you have the Oedipus complex. Or if you're totally reckless, then what he would say is his diagnosis would be, well, you didn't negotiate this phallic stage very well. So you had some problem between the ages of 3 to 6. All right, and then once you're 7, and I mean now think about I don't know if you can think back to the time when you were in school. It's kind of hard for me because I'm old, but for you guys can probably think back to the time you were 7, and you would be in second grade. So think about the time when you were in second grade. You're focused on friendships, you're focused on doing other activities, and starting sports, and like skateboarding, and you know what I mean, finding things you like to do, drawing maybe something like that, right? If you don't negotiate this stage very well, then he would say that that leads to sexual unfulfillment in your adulthood. And then the last stage is after puberty, right? So now we're talking like sort of your stage now, young adult stage, right? All the way to death. What you're trying to do is gain independence from your parents. Parents just don't understand. And if you do that well, um, then you have a sincere interest in others, and you have realistic enjoyment. So if you make it through all these stages without a lot of problems, you can end up in this bottom right hand corner where you're all happy, right? Nothing's wrong. You don't have to go to therapy and sit with Freud for an hour a week every week for the rest of your life, right? That's what he would say. Okay, so this is where we got to start taking notes again. We're going to talk about personality because Freud and his major contribution to psychology that is that everybody reacts to is his construction of personality, and he was the first theory to ever talk about like how people or why people behave the way they do and why their personality is the way it is. All right, so we'll start on the left-hand column, right? He divided your mind into 6 areas, right? The first 3 have to do with your level of awareness, right? So if we start off with the conscious, those are the ideas and thoughts that you notice. That you can pick out. You can tell when you first meet somebody, you say to yourself, "Wow, this person's really attractive," or "Oh my God, look at that person's hair," or like, "Why does that guy have a goatee?" Stuff like that. Those are conscious thoughts, right? Then you have another layer below that, your preconscious thoughts. And this is stuff that can be easily brought up to the surface, right? Easily recalled. And so in your preconscious area, that's stuff that might not be like readily running through your head, that you can pinpoint to, but you can always find it pretty easily. So it's that time when you're falling asleep and you have all those thoughts racing through your head. That's the preconscious part, and some of the conscious going on together. And then the layer furthest below that you're not really aware of is your unconscious. And the unconscious is where, remember, like Freud is thinking that if you experience something when you're small, when you're really little, that trauma, that whatever event is going to be stored in this unconscious place, right, way below your awareness. And he would say that your mind does that to protect you from traumatic things, right? So say someone that was really important in your life died, right? He would say that that's going to live in your unconscious for a really long time because that person was important to you, right? And if you are not aware that that's going on, that person is really important to you, it's going to come out in your everyday life in really weird ways, right? You're going to smell a smell that reminds you of this person, and you might freak out, right? Or you might hear their favorite song, or you might have a memory of you doing something together, and you're going to have a reaction to it, even though you may not be conscious of you thinking of that. Does that make sense to everybody? I have a visual thing on this next slide that might make it a little easier. Okay, so he's saying there's 3 levels of awareness, right? There's the conscious that we're always aware of, the preconscious that's kind of right below the surface, and then the unconscious, which is way down inside of us, way down in the back of your mind. So Cassidy, give me like a thumbs up when you're ready. I'm going to use you as a barometer for everybody else. Okay. So now the other half of the slide is, you have the 3 levels of consciousness, but you also have 3 levels of personality. All right. I mentioned the id before, right? And this is when you're a little kid, and little kids are perfect examples of id, right? Because all they want are cookies, right? All they want are pleasure, right? They do things that are fun, and everything else is boring and lame, and they don't like it. Luckily for them, they're kind of curious about everything, so they kind of enjoy a lot of things, but they operate on the pleasure principle, right? Things that feel good, they do. Things that don't feel good, they don't do, right? And so the id is throughout your entire life. I mean, eventually you add the ego and the superego onto it, but the id is throughout your entire life, right? And so you have this, primitive biological drives that are always with you, right? You always have to eat, right? You always have to, most people, have a survival instinct. You know what I mean? Those sorts of instincts are with you forever. But they dominate when you're a kid, when you're a little kid. Because all a kid can do is cry when they're hungry, right? Or when they have a messy diaper or something like that, right? The ego operates on the reality principle. So, where the id is only concerned with pleasure, the ego is only concerned with what can actually happen in real life. You know what I mean? That's why they call it the reality principle. And the ego makes sure that, whatever is going on is actually happening in reality. If it was up to the id, if you didn't like somebody, you just walk up and punch them in the face, right? But people usually don't do that. If they do, they get in trouble. Your ego is regulating you. It's saying you can't just walk up to somebody and punch them in the face, You can go like this, psh, or you can turn your back, you can ignore them, you can do a whole bunch of things. But what you can't do is punch people in the face, right, Ms. Doran?
That's right.
Ms. Doran says so. And the superego is a structure in your mind that Freud would say gets a lot of people in trouble. And it's your moral compass, which is a good thing, right? Everybody needs a moral compass. But it's the part of your mind also that evaluates everything. And it's the part that judges. So your superego is the thing in your mind that says, well, she's just a little hussy, or I don't like him because he is, he looks down on everyone, that sort of thing, right? Your superego, if it's too developed, Freud would say that's a very bad thing, and the reason why is because if you're only concerned in black and white, moral or immoral sort of things, and you don't see any gray area, it's really hard to operate in a world like that. You always feel guilty for things that you should do, right? You always feel bad about things that you didn't get to do, right? So your superego and your id are 2 extremes, and then the ego is the little referee in the middle. So this is that visual I was talking about. All right. So think of the conscious as an iceberg, right? The part that's sticking up above the water is the conscious. The part that's just below the surface, but that you could still see if you were, say, standing on the iceberg, that would be the preconscious part. And then deep underneath that you can't see from the surface, that's the unconscious part, right? And this is where all your unrational fears, live. This is where you judge yourself to be worthy or unworthy. This is where you have your violent instincts. This is where all your fears are, right? This is where all your shame lives, right? Is in the unconscious part of you. And Freud would say the more that's unconscious, the bigger part of the iceberg that's under the water, the more apt you are to feel like you're in trouble, like you're not worth it, like you have something wrong with you, that sort of thing, right? And those aren't good feelings to have. So how are we doing so far, everybody? That was a lot of information in a little bit of time. What questions do you have about the iceberg, the conscious, the id? Shoot me some questions here. You can click on your microphone if you want, or you could type it, or you could, Cassidy can just talk. Cassidy, how you doing? Yeah? I know you've already done some research on this, so you've kind of seen some of the stuff already, but those of you that didn't choose Freud as your research person, anything, what do you think of this stuff so far? Did I blow your mind already? It's like the third week. That'd be awesome. This is how I like to think of, while you guys are writing, this is how I like to think of your id, your ego, and your superego. Your id is the little devil over here, right? He just wants what's fun and pleasurable. Then you have your superego. He's the angel on your shoulder, right? And the angel on your shoulder always wants you to, do what's right, according to your moral compass. And then your ego is Homer here in the middle. And your ego is the referee, right? He understands what can actually be accomplished. And so he takes what feels good and what he should do and finds some way to try and meet those needs together, right? He tries to find something in reality to do. Oh, Carrie asked a good question. She asked, how does the unconscious affect your dreams? When we get to Jung, we're going to talk about some dreams. But remember that if all this stuff is underneath the water here in your unconscious, what it does is what the psychoanalysts believe is that when you dream, this stuff is what your dreams are pulling from, right? All these things below the surface. And so a psychoanalyst would say your dreams mean a lot. A cognitive therapist is going to say your dreams are just random misfirings of your neurons and it doesn't mean anything. But the psychoanalysts are going to say it means a whole lot, right? It's like a window into your unconscious. Does that make sense? Okay, so the id is the devil, right? So if you keep this image in your mind, this is how I always conceptualize the id. The id is the little devil on your shoulder. The superego is the angel. And then you in the middle, you are the ego, right? You're the person that regulates what can actually be done. So if the devil says, you know what, I'm really hungry, let's go get a hamburger. And then your superego is like, you should eat a hamburger, it's bad for you. You should have like a salad or something, right? And then your ego goes, well, let's stop by Qdoba and I'll get like some meat with my salad, right? There's a nice compromise, right? That's how it works. Okay, so that was Freud, right? And all of his theory. Now, Carl Jung is a colleague of Freud's at the same time. They're practicing at the same time. And Carl Jung kind of takes some of Freud's ideas and adds his own. So we're going to talk about dreams now. And Carl Jung's theory is called analytical psychology. I'm not sure that matters a whole lot to you guys, but that was the name of his theory. No, unique, that's fine. Thanks for trying. If you can hear me, is it still stuttering when I'm saying that? Let me type it. Yes, unique. Okay, so Carl Jung and analytical psychology. Jung was interested in a whole lot of things because, psychology was relatively new. So he was also into philosophy. He was into alchemy. He was into astrology, if you can believe that. He was into literature and the occult. And so a lot of his theory stems from interesting books that he's read. It stems from philosophy. And it also is influenced by Freud. So he was the chairman of the Vienna Psychological Society. And he kind of ran the society for a while. And his idea was called the collective unconscious. So we're going to talk about that here in a sec, what the collective unconscious is. And he kind of de-emphasized those stages I was talking about before, like the anal stage and the oral stage and the latent stage and that sort of thing. And he sort of struck out in new areas with the unconscious and with dreams. And he was heavily influenced by literature and philosophy. So, you're going to get a little philosophical with Jung. So if you like that sort of thing, Jung's your guy. Okay. So remember, when you're taking notes, you don't have to write down everything that's on the slide, right? What you want to do is you want to write down things that you think are important, so things that I've emphasized and talked a lot about. And you want to write down, in your own words, kind of the basic gist of the slide, right? So don't be copying, that's hard on your hand and, kind of unnecessary. What you need to do is make sure it's in your own words. That's going to help you the best. Okay? Okay, so let's talk about consciousness. He said there are four levels of consciousness, right? So if we're thinking of the iceberg again, he would divide it up into four areas instead of just conscious and preconscious and unconscious. He's going to divide it into four areas. He's saying there's a personal conscious, and in this personal consciousness is going to live what you know about yourself, right? Your feelings of identity, of who you are, of what's true about you. That lives in your own personal conscious, right? And you're always using it all the time because it's you. That's like your personality all rolled into one place. And then the personal unconscious would be, that part that's below the surface as Freud sees it, right? That's way below the surface of the iceberg. But then this is where Jung is going to add some things to the theory, right? He's going to say that there's a collective conscious and a collective unconscious. Collective means a group, right? And so he believes that there's a group consciousness, right? And he would define that as the roles and expectations of behaviors, the faces we put on for others, right? Because when we go out in public, he would say we're not really ourselves. We're a version of ourselves. But when you go in public, you try not to, scratch yourself in weird places, and you try not to pick your nose, right? And you try not to, do things that are socially unacceptable, like you don't stand really close to somebody you don't know. You know what I mean? There's like standards of behavior and expectations in society. And he would say that's what collective conscious is the expectations of society. And of course, because there's those expectations, we don't usually break those boundaries. It's really weird if someone comes up and stands right next to you and is like a close talker, like if I was doing this to you. That's really weird, and people get uncomfortable with that. And there's a reason why. It's the collective conscious. And then, here comes the philosophy, the collective unconscious is next. This is the deepest level of the psyche. Right? So this is like way, way under, that's under even the personal unconscious, right? So we're like, I don't know, if we're below iceberg almost at this point. And the collective unconscious is where all the cultural knowledge of a people are stored. I know this gets a little philosophical here, but he's going to talk about archetypes that live in the collective unconscious. And he says that there are these archetypes that occur throughout all cultures. And so since there are archetypes that occur throughout all cultures, like the trickster is one, right? There's a trickster in every culture, in every piece of literature, right? In every kind of um, um, society, right? So whether it's Loki for the Norse or Kokopelli for the Native Americans, right? And they're like vastly different. They never met each other, right? But they still have this trickster character. So he's saying that because that's there, then there has to be something that all humans have in common, and that's what the collective unconscious is. It's something that every human has in common with one another, like the Force. That's what I think of it as, like the Force. As Obi-Wan says, it binds us all together. Right? Okay, so here's some of these archetypes. I want you to write down persona. Okay, that's the most important one. Because the persona is that mask that we use when we're in public. We dress appropriately, we say the right things, we usually don't step outside the bounds of prescribed behavior because we just want to be liked and accepted. And so the persona is the social face that we present to the world. Now there's different other types of archetypes. I included a couple here, right? The animus is the collective unconscious of what masculinity is, as viewed by a female. See, isn't that weird? And then there's anima, right, which lives inside men. That's how men view females, how men view femininity. And he would say that, if you look at magazines, the construction of femininity in magazines, where the women are, in our culture, for instance, they're tall, they're skinny, they have lighter skin. Usually, they have straighter hair. Those types of things that our society views as pretty, that's the anima. And now it's different in our society from other societies, so keep that in mind. It wasn't always that way in our society even, but so it's not something that stays the same, but it's something that all people in our society, not all people, but most people in our society share. Other archetypes include the shadow, which is the least attractive parts of us. Think of that part of the unconscious that's underneath the iceberg. That's the shadow part of us, right? That is the least attractive, that we believe is the least attractive. And then self is one you need to write down. The self is, what he believes is, what makes you healthy. If you have a positive self, then you're going to be a healthy person. He doesn't say that if you have a good persona, a positive persona, that you will be healthy, because he doesn't believe that the mask you present to people out in the world is really your true self, right? He thinks that that's something that's not quite true. And so I know you've heard a lot about, letting people in and, letting people see your true self. This is where this comes from. It's from Jung, right? Getting past the persona, the mask you present, and getting to your actual self. And he's saying that that's where healthy is in yourself. How we doing? Is everybody's hand cramping yet? You doing okay? Yeah? Okay. We're almost done here, guys. Cramping. He's like, oh, my hand. Remember, don't write down everything. Write down in your own words. I'd put animus equals, sexy man or whatever, right? That's all you got to write. Okay, the last person we have to talk about. Let me show you. See, we don't have too many left. Just that. Is Adler. Now, Adler was also a student of Freud, and they were, or not a student, but a colleague of Freud. And he saw what Freud was doing, he saw what Jung was doing, and he comes up with his own kind of theory. He's interested in people's relationships. He's not so much interested in what their childhood was like. He's not so much interested in their unconscious, although you'll see a little bit of that later on when he talks about dreams and life goals and stuff. But he's interested in why people are the way they are with one another. And he believes that being social and being with people is healthy. So being you've heard the term antisocial, I'm assuming, but if you haven't heard the term antisocial, it comes from Adler here. He says that being social is an important part of being human, and being the opposite of that, being purposefully getting out and away from other people and living on your own by yourself is not normal. And he would say it's not healthy. And so we're going to talk about life goals, birth order, and inferiority. And then we're going to move on from Alfred Adler. But, he believed in life goals. He thought that, people had life goals, and whether you attain them or not was kind of that indicated whether or not you were happy with yourself, right? So if I have a goal that I'm going to become the, next all-star hockey player, and I don't attain that goal, then that's going to really affect me negatively. If I do attain that goal, think of how awesome I'm going to feel, right? So he says, our life goals and whether we attain them or not are really important. He also came up with this cool idea of birth order, which we'll talk about a little later when we talk about lifespan. But birth order and your role in the family, he would say is very important. Whether you're the first kid, the youngest kid, somewhere in the middle, whether you act like the oldest even though you're not the oldest, right? That sort of stuff. So all those things he thinks are important. And inferiority versus superiority, which I'll define a little bit later, so you don't have to write the definition down yet. Let's talk about birth order, because this is the most fun with Adler. So now he's saying here that this is generally speaking how most families work. Most the kid section of the family works. And so you can test this out with your family, right? You can ask your parents what, if they were the oldest or the second or the middle or the youngest or the only or whatever. You can do this with your friends. It's kind of fun to do this with your friends. You should ask the teachers. This is going to be fun. So like when you see a teacher this week, you can ask them what their birth order is, and you can be like, oh, now I get it. Okay, so the oldest in the family tends to, I'm going to say tends because it's not always true, but tends to act like an adult, and be more closely connected to the adults. It, that person tends to be more responsible, tends to be higher achieving in school and in work, is really driven to, succeed in, whatever they determine is their goal in life, being a lawyer or, getting a high paying job, something like that. So really driven. Now the second is competitive. Can you guess why? Why would the second be the most competitive? Let's have somebody from home answer me that. Why do you think the second child is the most competitive? Well, Christina's going to give us an answer. Ah, there we go. Yep, because they're comparing themselves to the oldest, right? Cassie, what were you going to say? You say the same thing? Cassidy is echoing you, Christina. She's saying the same thing, right? The second, as soon as they're born, has to compete, right, for attention from adults, for not getting hand-me-downs, right, and all that stuff. So the second tends to be really competitive, and the second tends to be the opposite personality-wise from the oldest. So whatever the oldest does, the second does the opposite. Now this takes a while to develop, right? So if there's two kids in the family, a lot of times the younger kid will follow around the older kid for a while, right? Until the older kid starts being like, God, get out of here. You're like my younger sibling. You're cramping my style, right? And pushes him away. And then the second will be like, well, fine, screw you. I'm just going to be totally opposite. I'll tell you, this worked in my family. My sister went to a completely different high school from me because, she got the whole, oh, you're David's sister. You're going to be a good student and, blah, 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 right? And so she was like, as soon as she could, she got, went to a different high school. She joined the IB program just to get away from me. You can believe that. I don't know why. I'm so awesome. She's come around though later on. She got older. The middle kid, if there's a couple of older kids and a couple of younger kids, the middle one often feels left out, right? But tends to be the peacemaker because the person's always compromising, right, between the oldest generations and the younger generations of the kids. So the middle person most often feels left out. I'm sure we can all imagine that, right? And the middle one tends to act out the most. Maybe the problem child, if there is a problem child in the family. Of course, the youngest can be kind of like that too. I don't know what your family's like, but the youngest person tends to be the most pampered, right? Because the parents, once they get through 2 or 3 kids or however many, and they get down to the youngest, they're like, oh my God, I'm so happy you're here. And sometimes the youngest is the only kid around, right? Where the older kids have moved out and gone. And you can tell Doran over there like what order she's in. But the youngest also tends to be the most manipulative too, because in order to get the attention as the youngest member of the family, you have to manipulate people in order for them to get to know you, right? So they tend to be manipulative, is what Adler would say. And then of course you have the only children, right? The ones that are just by themselves. They share a lot of similarities with the oldest, but because there's no other kids around, they tend to be less cooperative, They tend to care less about what other people think about them. They tend to be a little more selfish. Since they're the oldest, they tend to deal well with adults just like the oldest does. So you can think about where in your family you lie and whether or not you match this or not. But think also about, if you have an older brother or sister, let's pretend that this person is developmentally disabled or something, right? And is only going to ever reach maybe the cognitive ability of a 10-year-old or something like that, right? If that's the case, then the second child may act like the oldest child, even though the second child is younger than the oldest, right? And then the oldest child may act like the second child. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not necessarily strictly in terms of your birth order, but it's the role in the family. So think of it like that. All right, and the last thing we need to talk about is inferiority and superiority. he doesn't mean like you're inferior to somebody else or you're superior over something else. He's talking about inferiority and superiority within yourself. So if you have feelings all the time that you're not good enough, or that you didn't make it, or that you are, somehow, I'm trying to think of another word other than inferior. If you think of yourself in a negative way, that you're not good enough, that's inferiority. So, like we talked about with the life goals, right? If you have this life goal and you don't attain it, that can lead to, inferiority, right? And superiority is the opposite, right? Mastery, competence, being really good at something. So, if you can set a goal, reach the goal, master the goal, then you have a feeling of superiority. That's what he would say. Christina, it's exactly like insecurity. Yeah, Freud's term for it would be insecurity, and Adler's term for it would be inferiority. So I don't know if you've heard of the term inferiority complex, but this is where it comes from. Okay, so we're almost done. I know this took a long time, and typically the other ones aren't going to take this long, but since this is the foundation of everything else, we kind of have to do this. In order for you to understand everything else, we have to start here. So thanks for sticking with me here. It's been a long one, I know. But see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're almost there. Okay, so common techniques. Freud liked free association, and this is where he would call them patients. I'm going to call them patients. The patient is lying down, and the psychologist is throwing out words like school, right? And then the patient is saying whatever's the first thing that comes to his or her mind. Carrie, good question. I'm going to come back to that, okay? And so if I throw out school, right? Somebody might respond with fun or writing or math or bully or and so that'll tell you about what the person understands of that concept, right? That's free association. Freud would use transference. Transference is a psychological term for when you're in therapy with somebody and you view your therapist as somebody else. Not just your therapist, as your father, not just your therapist, but as a coach, not just your therapist, but as your mother, not just a therapist, but as something else. And Freud would use that, so like if you were thinking of Freud not just like a therapist, but like a father, then he would use that in order to help you work through that time in your life. It probably happened to you when you were young, right? So he would help you work through that. And he would always call it working through issues, right? So like your time in therapy every week for, I don't know, 10 years or something, is going to be working through whatever the issue is. And that was what he would do. And a lot of you, what you said before about like what therapy is, comes from this idea of Freud, right? So it's a therapist sitting behind the patient, and the patient's on a couch talking about their life, right? Jung, of course, was into dream interpretation, right? So instead of just doing free association and that sort of thing, he would ask you to talk about your dreams. And then from the dreams, he would talk about some archetypes that were in there, right? And then they would use that to kind of, figure out what your presenting problem was and then find solutions for it. When we get to the humanists, we're going to talk about play therapy, and they use a lot of Jung's theories in play therapy and in Santre therapy, so we'll see that later on. And then Adler would do a lifestyle assessment, so he would make you talk about your goals, right? And what birth order you were and that sort of thing, right? And then he would take the therapy direction from that. And then he had this technique of acting as if, is what he called it. So he would say, well, this week let's try acting as if you weren't afraid of snakes, right? And see where that got you. That was one of his common techniques. All right, guys, we made it. I do have some questions to answer, like from Carrie and stuff, and I want you guys to ask questions. I kind of had prepared to do a little discussion. I plan on going here, right, like this, so you can see my giant head. I plan on talking about some of these things with the notes, but I think we're going to have to take that to we're going to have to take that to the discussion this week. Okay? But I do want you to, pop into this poll here before we go today. All right? I'm just kind of interested in, how you're viewing the psychoanalyst and the psychodynamics. So do you think it sounds interesting? Do you think it's a bit too weird for you? I think I know what Sam's going to say, if she's still here. Okay, so let's get to Carrie's question. She said, where would I find more information on Jung's dream interpretation? Carrie, the answer to that is there's a whole bunch of books on dream interpretation, and almost any website you go to that's on dream interpretation comes from like a Jungian perspective. So, anything that you find on dream interpretation, has its roots in Jung and his archetypes and that sort of thing. So, the easiest way to do it, Carrie, would be just to go to Google, type in dream interpretation or type in archetypes, and you'll find the whole giant list of them and a whole bunch of websites that are all just about dream interpretations. You could also type in dream dictionary. Let me type that down here. If you guys are interested in the dream stuff, dream dictionary. If you Google that, you'll find a bunch of sets of archetypes. So, for instance, snakes are kind of a common thing in dreams. And, a Jungian has a specific idea of what the snake means in your dream, right? So, and they have a bunch of them. Actually, yes, lucid dreaming is part of psychology, yeah, and it has been studied. Yes, it has. They've studied dreams in a whole bunch of altered perceptual states, right? So dreams when you're happy or sad, dreams when you are under the influence of drugs or not drugs, dreams when you are younger versus older, all those sorts of things. Plenty of things have been studied. Yeah, and hopefully we'll get to do a little bit of dream journaling and dream analysis a little bit later on. We did last year. It was pretty fun. So we'll come back to the dreams and the archetypes and everything. Don't worry. It's too much fun not to, isn't it? All right, guys. When you have questions about, what defines healthy for the psychoanalysts, or where do problems come from, or what does treatment look like, those are things that you just need to call, text, email me, right? And then we can talk about it. Okay? I know we've kind of run a little bit longer and we didn't quite get to the discussion, so let's try and make the discussion in the message board this week really robust. And so make sure that you don't just answer the question, but that you respond to others, right? And that's what keeps the discussion lively and interesting and ongoing. And you have to respond to others for proficient anyway, right? So you can kill like 8 birds with 1 stone there. You know what I'm saying? So let's talk about these things in the discussion. So I might go into the discussion and change a little bit and add, these 3 questions in there, just so that we can start talking about them as a group. Okay? I'm going to stick around if you want to. I'm going to stop recording and stuff. But if anybody wants to stick around and talk about, like the dream interpretation stuff, or that seemed like a pretty interesting thing for a lot of people, or if somebody wants to talk about the anything really with psychoanalysis, I'm going to be here. Okay, so if you are watching at home, feel free to continue watching if you want to. But we're done with the content so far this week. I know it was a lot, but thanks for sticking with us. Anybody have any questions that you want to talk about while we're relaxing? I got some time here. If anybody wants to ask me, I've been getting lots of messages here as I was sitting here. People don't like it when I don't get right back to them. They don't know that I teach, I guess. I don't know. I don't know where my webinar is. All right, so somebody throw a question out there and we'll answer. You guys want to grab the mic or you want to type? It's up to you. Doesn't really matter to me. Cassie, I know you have other work to do. You can stay here and talk and discuss if you want, or you can go do that, whatever. Whatever you wish. How's the research going, everybody? Anybody need help on that while I'm here? Christina, you doing okay? Oh, there we go. Sorry, things weren't posting there. Christina, I haven't seen your question. Sorry, I got like stuck there when I'm scrolling down now finally. Christina, no. If you have work from last week, you just want to do it, you know? Bye, Emma. And bye, Sam. Well, it looks like you already dropped off, so see you later, I guess. Cassie, thanks for coming in. Take care. Okay. All right, Christina, you have a good one too. Ashley, you're still here, right? All right. Weird question. If you continue to have recurring dreams, nightmares, and you get often over and over again, um, well, Jung would say that yes, like recurring dreams are the most meaningful dreams because you keep having them, right? So they must be a reason, right? And he would say that if it's, he would want you to write down the dream, right? And sort of, and he would like deconstruct it. So he would look for archetypes, right? Symbols in the dream that mean things. And then he would look for, why the symbols mean what they do and sort of explain it to you. And then he would say, okay, so now that we know what the symbols are, why do you think you're having this dream? Like what's the problem around the symbols and how would you deal with that? And so that's how he would approach it. Like if you were in therapy with him, that's what it would go like. But he would say, like to your question, that recurring dreams are the most important ones. Have you had any? I mean, it sounds like you have, right? And people vary wildly with how much they remember from their dreams and how much they don't. So when we end up doing this dream analysis later on, some people like don't remember anything from their dreams. I'm kind of like that sometimes, you know. Yeah, I had a horrible recurring dream for about 2 years. The same dream, like a couple months apart for a couple of years, you know. Yeah, I know, and they're really powerful, aren't they? Yeah. No, I still remember mine like it was yesterday, and I don't remember dreams usually ever. I have to be like woken up in the middle of my dreaming in order for me to remember them. You know.